Well, hello, and thank you to our studies. And we've normally been saying the epistles of John, but that changes tonight.
I may say John for the next 3 weeks.
Well, you know me, I say the wrong thing all the time, so...
Yeah, so I'm going to try to fix on the fact that we're talking about the Apostle Peter here. But
Peter. We begin with Peter tonight, and so we are studying 1 Peter, and we want to say thank you to you for joining us for this study. And if you would like a handout, we're going big time now. We're getting really high tech. If you would like a handout of the studies, we've got some handouts that we can email to you. So just send us a note, and we will make sure you get one of the handouts. Now, we can't exactly promise we're going to follow the handout. Who knows where we'll go with this? We'll just have to wait and see really what comes out of Mark's mouth and what I've got to roll with. Is that the way it works?
Well, it's kind of like Gerald said. Where is the Spirit going to move?
We may be moved by a lot of things. So, but first of all, let's just, if you can pivot. Doesn't he look good? Last week he was Evander Holyfield. Now he's just little Frankenstein with all those stitches. How many stitches have you got in that ear?
Just a whole bunch.
Yeah.
He went plastic on me.
He went plastic?
Yeah.
A little plastic surgery?
Yeah. Yes.
All right. Well, you look good. So, and you get those out when? Next week?
Monday.
Next Monday.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, here we go. Hopefully you have the Heavenly Library with you. Take down the book of 1 Peter and you can follow along with us. And again, if you have your handout, you can use the handout and we can email one to you certainly so that you're ready for future studies. Now, as we have always done with these studies, we're not exactly sure how many lessons we're going to take. But we're going to go through the letter, not so much verse by verse, but really emphasizing the points that are shared by Peter, because I'll have to say, when you get into this, like all the Bible, it's relevant. But boy, just for some reason, 1 Peter just seems to have extra significance for us today.
It should scream to us today. And you're going to see that when we start getting into it. But he's basically talking about future persecution, distress that they're going to have to be going through. And what have we been going through this past year and a half, and what's facing us in our future as far as the church is concerned, and how people are going to be viewing us. It may not be as easy on us in the future as we're speaking what God wants us to speak and believing what God wants us to believe, and us telling people about that may not sit well with people. So this is a great book for us to be studying.
All right, well, let's just talk about a few of the, you might say, high points in the book, things that we need to know before we get into what Peter wants us to know specifically. Letter written late 1st century, probably not as late, I would say, as the epistles of John, but after the destruction of Jerusalem.
You think so?
You think so? You think it was on... It couldn't be the epistles of John.
No.
Peter's gone by then, so
That's right.
we're looking. And
Peter,
when I say late, I'm talking like 60 A.D., getting into that time frame.
I'm going to take the position historically. If he died in Rome in 64, 65, 66, then this is before the destruction of Jerusalem. Very definitely.
Oh, did I say after?
Yeah.
Oh, see, there you go. I've already said something. Yeah, and I didn't even get to John or Peter. Yeah, no, this would be before the destruction of Jerusalem. I think these are events coming up.
This has to be.
Yeah.
And the church is going to be being persecuted. But in addition, the Jews are really about to be persecuted and so if some of these brethren were Jewish, they're having a double whammy about to hit them. It's their nation is going to be going down, and also the church is being persecuted. So he's trying to get them prepared for this.
Well, the persecution, though, is different. We're not talking about a persecution that Jesus endured and James, the brother of John, endured at the hands of the religious leaders and the Jews. This is now shifted to Rome.
Nero is going to have a huge persecution between 64 and 68 on Christians. Yeah. And so this is what Peter is trying to prepare them for.
Yeah, so we're about 30 plus years past the crucifixion of Jesus. So we're just getting into that second half later of the 1st century.
And 30 years less than John.
Yeah.
So He's right in between.
It's a tumultuous time frame if you really go from AD 64 up to possibly the writings of John.
Yes.
And we see what's really happening. Now, here's what's also kind of interesting. If you go back to the Gospels and the ministry of Jesus, this is what everybody wanted Jesus to deal with. Let's talk about Rome.
Yes.
How do we handle Rome? What are you going to do with Rome? And for the first time, you really find Rome being addressed.
Yes.
And it's not necessarily the address you would expect.
Even in code.
Yeah.
And so they're just being careful even about mentioning the name. Just like over in Revelation, it's code because Rome is so powerful. Our brethren are having to hear about them and what's going to be happening to them without the Romans really understanding what's being said in this literature.
Yeah.
And so, yes, they are very powerful.
Mark mentioned the code. So what you'll hear Peter talk about is a fiery trial coming upon you.
Yes.
And that's his reference to persecution. You see that in chapter 4 verse 12. But then at the very end of the letter, in verse 13, I think his reference there to Babylon
Yes, is Rome.
is indeed a reference to Rome. And that's the persecution that's coming. So our theme, if you're looking for a theme, here's what I got. Suffering for the cause of Christ.
Yes.
What do you say?
Basically the same, preparing them for the persecution. You're going to be in a stressful situation here in the next few years. How do you handle that with God helping you? That is what they are hearing.
And 16 times, pretty much in the letter, he mentions this concept of suffering. Now, I mentioned just a moment ago, we're finally addressing Rome, or Rome's finally getting addressed. Not exactly the address everybody wanted, because Peter, in essence, is going to say, Rome stays.
Yes.
The persecution, the suffering, is probably going to stay for a while. Learn to endure it.
How do you handle it? And these first century Christians are being told very quickly over in Revelation, during that persecution, it was be faithful unto death.
Right.
I mean, John just goes out and says it. You've got to be faithful unto death. And so your death may come sooner than you would anticipate, but Peter is writing this with the attitude knowing that he's about to die, very likely.
Right. Yeah.
And so look how he's encouraging people when in fact he may be weeks, months, a year away from dying himself.
Well, and I kind of assumed that it wasn't long after the second letter that he did give his life for the cause of Christ. And you see that. A theme verse, possibly. I like 1 Peter 2:21-22. For to this you've been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. In other words, learn to suffer like Jesus.
Yes.
Yeah. Powerful, powerful. Well, let's get into it. We're probably not going to get very far. We gave you that warning. I still actually have a few more introduction notes I'd like to share. But let's go ahead and begin in chapter 1 and verse 1. Ready to roll?
Yes.
Peter. Now, that's a little different from John. I stopped us right off the bat.
That's right.
John never mentions his name. Peter does.
Never, ever.
Yeah, John never mentioned his name when he was writing his epistles, but Peter does. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father in the sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ and for sprinkling with his blood, may grace and peace be multiplied to you. I think we need to stop. There was a lot there.
We may not get out of these first few verses here because Peter said a mouthful, and in fact, it's probably all one sentence. But it's an amazing fact that he is talking to. He is addressing brethren here, and then you have who are these dispersed, and he picks out Asia Minor, basically.
Right.
This is present day Turkey. If you look at these places here, he starts up in the northeast with Pontus, and begins to take in a southern easterly direction till he gets down into Cappadocia. Then he begins to take more of a westerly direction, and then ends back up at Bithynia, right next to Pontus.
Right.
So he's circulating. It's a circular pattern he's using here for basically Asia Minor. He's talking about present day Turkey.
Well, and what's interesting, when you go through like Acts, you see that the church, while it had its beginning in infancy in Judea, Jerusalem, you find that the real strength and growth of Christianity moves beyond those borders and really goes into Asia Minor. You think of Paul's first journey in these areas that he preached, where John would be possibly writing the epistles in Ephesus. We're talking about that region.
Yes, you're looking at the southern border of Turkey in the Galatia area, right there at the seashore, and a few miles above that, and then you follow that shoreline up into Asia, what is called, and then Ephesus being the most powerful there. Then you move over into Greece, Macedonia and Greece. But here, he's addressing people now who would be somewhat north and easterly of where Paul was. If you remember,
Paul wanted to go there.
He wanted to go to Bithynia, and the Spirit wouldn't let him go.
There.
And so these have come on later, probably by Paul's preaching in Asia. Then these things have spread into these areas.
Yeah, Galatia, North Galatia.
Yeah.
Okay, the geography is actually the easy part of this.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
When we start talking about elect and chosen.
Let's just get into it.
Yes.
Now, I like to take the position anytime you study a letter, just look at it without all the controversies, all the things that man's done to just muddy the waters.
Yes.
And so in a real simple way, can we start there? Peter is writing to those who are favored by the Lord, the elect, who are exiles. He's later going to refer to them as pilgrims and sojourners in chapter 2. And aren't all of we? This world is not our home. We are just passing through. To those who are dispersed. Now, to me, the dispersion would simply speak to something that's happening in that day and age where Christians are being persecuted and therefore having to disperse. We've already... You see that in history with Rome, that they are pushed out of Rome. We see that they're moved in certain areas to escape. Well, just Acts 2, they were dispersed when the persecution hit in the book. So that first church that began in Acts 2 is later in chapter 8.
Yes.
Persecuted scatter, so there was a dispersion there. To me, this is a dispersion that's coming possibly from the hands of Rome. And so Christians are being caused to scatter, and Peter says, this is for you.
Yeah, and I think these are Gentiles he's primarily talking to.
Hence the region.
Hence the regions. I'm sure that there were some Jews in this area because they had been dispersed before by God.
Right.
And so these would be the remaining Jewish people that were the Assyrian, and they were put into these regions, so Hellenistic Jews. But this is primarily Gentiles that he's talking to. Now, you're talking about Peter here writing to Gentiles.
I was thinking that exact same thing.
When you look at the irony here, because
this isn't the same Peter from the book of Galatians that Paul had to get on to.
That he had to get on to. Yeah. This is a little later. This is the Peter that was sent to Cornelius.
Yeah.
And he had to swallow hard there. But now he's writing to Gentiles.
And he refers to them as the elect.
Yes.
Now, to me, in its simple context, it is just simply a word used to describe favorites. Those who are easily recognized by God, that God sees distinct from those who are unbelievers.
Yes.
These are my elect. I don't think in any way is God saying, you're in, you're out. These are the ones I chose from the very beginning. I've elected in a Calvinistic way. Quite the contrary. I think it's just simply a term of affection, because you're going to see it a little bit later when you get to chapter 2, that you are a royal priesthood. You are a holy nation, a people for God's own possession. He's speaking to believers.
You go back to 2 Thessalonians, 2nd chapter, where he's talking about you've been called through the gospel. Mm-hmm. You've been chosen because you've responded to the gospel. So those terms, we get a little confused when you start seeing this term chosen or elected. Mm-hmm. Chosen. How did he choose us? Well, he chose us generically. He chose us through the gospel.
Through Christ.
Here's the gospel. It is being preached. You respond to the gospel. What happens? You've now been chosen.
Yeah, and you become God's own people. That's the election, if you will, or the chosen part of it. And just if you've ever had somebody come to you and say, well, this person was in and God made that choice at the very beginning, and then this person was out. Well, Peter would contradict himself if that was his position, because when you get to 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9, he says, God doesn't desire for any to perish, but wants all men to come to repentance.
But oh, by the way, I've only chosen a few of you, and the rest of you are going to destruction.
That doesn't fit.
That doesn't fit that particular passage.
And Peter would contradict himself in the same way Paul would be contradicting himself if that was his position with that wording. When you get to his words, he shares with Timothy in 1 Timothy 2.
When Calvin, back in the 1500s, began to promote, I guess it was Augustine really did it in the 400s and 500s, but that sort of fell by the wayside, and then he picked this back up in the 1500s. Verse 2 then, if you put 1 and 2 together, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, now if you just stop there, that's saying the chosen were foreknown.
Right.
You're just putting those two together. So this is a Calvinistic passage here. If you go back over to Ephesians 1.
If you stop there.
If you stop there.
Right.
And if you select out those few little words.
Right.
And then try to begin to promote some sort of beliefs system, well, I've got those words right there. I've got chosen and by the foreknowledge of God. So we have to be careful of that. Look what it says there in the whole thing, by the sanctifying work of the Spirit. And now you got to work through all of those things.
And then the obedience to Jesus is a part of it. Then the sprinkling with His blood.
That you may obey Jesus Christ. If I have been elected, why do I have to obey?
Yeah, so you put it all together.
Yes.
If you have your handout, I'm just going to define some words here for you in just their simple definition coming from the Greek and the way they're intended by Peter. The elect would be favorites. Yes. These are the ones. You're different from the rest of the world. You are my favorites. Exiles would simply refer to those who are strangers to this world. This world is not their home. Just like we sing in the song, I'm just passing through. Pilgrims, if you will. Same thing you see in the wonderful people of faith in Hebrews 11. They were looking to a city whose builder and maker was God. Foreknowledge would simply be the idea of forethought. This was the plan.
Yes.
This was my plan from the beginning. This is the foreknowledge of God, that there would be salvation through Jesus. And this was part of the plan, that you would be sanctified.
Yes.
That the plan is to take those who have been stained with sin, and through Christ they are sanctified, set apart for a higher calling, a higher purpose, those who were ransomed, as we're going to see. And so you see that purification. And then the last thing you see is simply obedience. These are those who have chosen to submit and comply to my will. It's really simple terminology, but it's very powerful when you think about it, because he's defined those saints in a very powerful way.
The term foreknowledge, some people translate then predestination, and so there is that term in Ephesians 1 and here then of you were predetermined, you, the chosen. Mm-hmm. And so that's how we have to be very careful with using these terms. We need to use them biblically,
right,
looking at the whole system. Being sprinkled with His blood is very unique in the sense of the meaning of that. The Jewish concept would understand that very much so. If you go back to every sin offering in the Old Testament, every one of them, some animal had to be destroyed. A life was given, and then what did they do to every one of those sacrifices? They took a portion of that blood and sprinkled it at the altar. Yeah. And so this is a reference back to that blood being shed as a sacrifice for the sins, and that blood being sprinkled.
And if you look at it, I think these first couple of verses, Peter is giving us a little bit of an insight into here's what's coming up. Because throughout the letter, he's going to reference, hey, you're suffering and persecuted, but God knows who you are.
Yes.
You are his chosen people. He loves you. He is with you. Here is his plan in Jesus to make you holy. For you shall be holy, for I am holy. We're going to see a little later. And then, just like you said, that blood, well, you haven't just been redeemed with silver and gold. No. He's going to say you've been redeemed with the precious blood of the Lamb. That's actually verse 19. That's your sprinkling came through Jesus.
Yes, and so look what he has done for you. Yeah. If Jesus had not been sacrificed, none of this other would matter. So the important thought here is Jesus Christ. What is he going to mean to you? And we're going to be hearing all of that through these next 5 chapters of what Peter's going to be referring to.
So he's writing to people now, if you're following our thought here, to people who are going to suffer and may already be suffering dispersed for the cause of Christ, including Peter himself. But before he even gets into any of the suffering and how to handle it, he reminds brethren of who they are in the eyes of God.
So these next 7 verses are so important to build up, and we're not going to have time to do those today, but these verses 3 now through 7 or 8, just look what God has done. Read those before our next lesson. And so he's building these people up. This is what God has done for you. And now you need to be prepared for the onslaught. Sure. But look what he's done for you.
Well, and may this peace and grace be multiplied.
Yes.
Maybe that's a good place to pick up next week. How about we pick up right there?
I think that's a great spot.
May grace and peace be multiplied to you. That's a good elder's blessing.
Yes.
Maybe I'll just finish with that part. Anything else you want to say on those first 2 verses? We did not get very far at all.
Well, Peter, you're going to see that there may be some things that we need to look into. It's interesting. Peter will say over in 2 Peter that Paul has written. You have writings of Paul that you have in front of you, and yes, there are some things there that might be a little difficult to understand. You got to dig into it. Well, Peter, you've got some things that you got to dig into a little bit as well.
Peter has his own heavy stuff, and so it's good. And with that in mind, can we just share with everybody who's watching, listening, whether you're on the podcast or watching YouTube, if you have any questions or comments that you want to share as we go through this study, let us know. We would love to hear from you. And a reminder again, if you would like one of the handouts, just let us know. We can make sure and email that to you. So, there's our introduction.
Yes.
Anything else you want to add to that?
I'm looking forward to the next lesson.
We got a lot to do.
Yes, we do.
A lot of good stuff to dig into. And I believe, like Mark said at the very beginning, this is going to be extremely relevant to all of us living in this world today.
Yes, it is.
All right. Well, praise God, brethren. This world is not our home, but while we're here, we're going to learn from the Apostle Peter how to live in this world.
And just be so comforted by the fact that you have been chosen by God. If you have done what he has asked you to do. That should be a very comforting thought.
Extremely comforting. And we'll leave you with that. The blessing coming from Peter. May grace and peace be multiplied to you.